It was Patton who said, if everyone's thinking the same, then somebody ain't thinking. And I like to bring you guys and read different perspectives on what the Fed is doing and why they're doing it. But I think one narrative that should be dispelled altogether is that the Fed is dumb, right? That the people over there are just super surprised that raising rates is causing the chaos that it's causing. If they are that dumb, um, I think that's the most naive perspective. So you got to question then if they're not dumb and they're doing it intentionally, what is the motive? I've talked about people like Danielle DiMartino Booth, who she says the motive is somewhat altruistic. It's to kind of hurt Europe and help the United States. Um, but I ran across another guy. He's kind of become a household name in the last couple of days, Balaji, on Twitter, because he made a $1 million bet that we're going to hit hyperinflation in the next 90 days. And he draws these conclusions off facts. And I want to bring you those. And I have some notes here, and then I want to show you his Twitter thread, which I will link in the description below. But pulling an economic ninja here, I got some notes. So, um, first thing to think about, remember in 2020 and 2021, the Fed told banks, remember, they go off of Jerome Powell's tone. So the Fed runs the banking system to a certain degree. But he said they're not even thinking about raising rates. And then he jawboned that the terminal rate would be very low and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so he said those things. So in 2021, what happened? Stimulus money went out, real estate went up, stock market went up. People had cash, lots of it. Where do they put that cash? When they cash out refi on their home, they put it in banks. What do banks have to do with that money? Because all of a sudden they have a liability. They need to offset that with an asset. So what do? They go out and buy treasuries, and they go out and buy mortgage-backed securities at historically low rates. Fed knows this is happening. They're not done. Okay. Then Jerome Powell head fakes and um, says inflation's transitory, yada, yada, yada. They keep buying mortgage backed securities. And then he raises at a historically fast rate, causing these banks to have these bonds and treasuries where they had historic inflows of cash to be not necessarily insolvent, but illiquid. I've said this before. If you bought a 10-year bond as a bank or a 10-year treasury as a bank, and that was yielding 1%. But today, you can go out on the free market and buy a 10-year bond that's yielding 5. What do you have to do as that bank with that 10-year bond that yields 1? You have to lower the price to sell it. So that's what they're doing. It's kind of like if you were to buy a home, and you bought that home for 500,000 in 2006, and 2009 you need to sell it, but you can only sell it for 300. So, but you pretend it's still worth 500 because you're like, you know what? I'm going to wait to sell it to 2025. So it's still worth 500, still worth what I paid for it. Banks are doing the same thing with these treasuries when they put it on their hold to maturity line on their bank statements and their financials. So, like I said, banks are forced to offset. Jerome Powell raises rates at the fastest level, or the fastest speed, and so the Fed's hiding the ball from banks, and the banks are forced to hide the ball from their depositors because now they are illiquid, like I said. So they put these balances on hold to maturity, and as long as tons of people don't need their money right now, then they're fine. But a lot of people need their money, and they're figuring out that almost every bank has the same problem because when the cash came in, they went and bought mortgage-backed securities and and treasuries at historically low interest rates, and the Fed raised rates. Okay, so banks are hiding the ball from their depositors, and you got to think. Another thing that Balaji talks about is we have regulators who regulate banks who knew this and know these banks are insolvent and or liquid, and yet don't warn depositors. What are those regulators there for? Right? They know this. They're not dumb. They know this is happening, and and this is why words travel so fast. In the information age, in the internet age, it takes people just digging into financials. Okay, page 75, section B. Okay, hold to maturity. You're $80 billion underwater, SVB. So people start to panic. Okay, it's not just SVB. So, what does the Fed do in response to this collapse that's happening, this banking collapse? Then they come in and they say, "Hey, we're going to backstop FDIC to a million to infinity dollars." But I did a video on this the other day, Janet Yellen. But only certain banks, also known as big banks, too big to fail. So, what is the incentive? Liquidate your money out of these smaller community banks who are holding these MBSs and treasuries, and then deposit them in the big banks. You got to think to yourself, why would the Fed and Treasury want to consolidate power in these big banks? More on that later. Okay. Um, on top of that, the timeline, and openly saying this, July is when the Fed Now is coming. The Fed Now, CBDC, central banking, um, you can call it a CBDC, but it's the Fed's money that banks can transfer back and forth on a blockchain. So his contention is they're trying to block the exits. The Fed and the Treasury know they're in a pinch. They've known they're in a pinch for this entire time, and they're trying to collapse small banks to consolidate into four different banks. So four big banks, if you will, because bigger banks, if there's only four of them, when you got the free market, and you guys have seen this over the last 2 years, when you got the free market and you can choose from multiple different locations to buy your stuff, to go to school, et cetera, when you have choice, it's a lot harder to control. What's a lot easier to control? When you only have two big players, right, in the free market, or you got four big players in the banking system. And what's the incentive for these banks? You want free infinite money from the Fed and the Treasury? Then play ball. So let's take a look at his Twitter, and also I'm going to link kind of a debate he did with a group of guys on YouTube. I'll link that in the description below. But I think this is all great to think through. All right, so he has a couple of graphs here. Number one, Federal Reserve weekly remittances to the Treasury. The Federal Reserve is losing money because guess who else bought those treasuries? The Fed. Okay. Does this look like a normal graph to you? Normal chart? Right? If you know nothing about economics, you're like, okay, what's this little what's this iceberg here off to the right? And what that means is the Fed's losing money, and remittances to the Treasury mean money that the Fed earns. It goes back to the Treasury, right? So they're not for-profit bank. But what happens if they lose money? Treasury has to bail them out. Hence why the Treasury and the Fed are kind of working together on this. Unrealized losses on investments in securities. This is in the this is the source from FDIC. Again, another iceberg. Okay. And the last thing I want to show you is this FDIC worried about growing unrealized losses in U.S. banks and bond portfolios. Balaji does a great job of linking all of his work and articles and Fed speaking minutes and FDIC papers all before SVB collapsed. They knew this was coming. They're not dumb. So if they know it's coming, why are they doing it intentionally? Option B would be, I would assume, deflation, because if they do nothing, if they don't backstop these big banks, then you're going to have deflation. Why? Because these banks, people lose money. If they go insolvent and people with over 250,000 can't get their money, number one. Number two, the FDIC doesn't have the money to backstop multiple banks. So they're focusing on the big ones. So let's go through this Twitter thread specifically. And like I said, I'll link it in the description. He has all these links to insolvency, FDIC minutes, all before SVB happened. He writes, just as in 2008, bankers lied. This time the central bankers and the bank regulators have lied to all dollar holders and depositors. Again, why do we have regulators? Why do we have the policemen of the financial world, the SEC, these regulators? They're the policemen of the financial world, yet they don't do police stuff. We pay their salary. We're taxpayers. They don't help the depositor, which is what their job is. Okay. Further reading. This isn't your typical fractional reserve situation. The problem is that there isn't enough in the banks on the mark to market basis, meaning if they were to sell the treasuries today, they will get 100 cents on the dollars in 10 years when they mature. But what if they have to sell them today, which is what SVB had to do on a mark to market basis to cover the withdrawals? They knew this. They knew this through all of last year and communicated it internally in their coded language. It is obvious from the graph, see below, central banks and the bankers and the banking regulators all knew the huge crash is coming. The phrase is unrealized losses, but they never notified you, the depositor. Never notified you. Now you got to think why. Got to ask yourself why. And you can come to a different conclusion than him, but he makes some good points. Instead, the regulators allowed banks to hide their literal insolvency in the footnotes until one guy figured it out. This is nobody on the internet, who's obviously fairly smart, figured out what SVB's balance sheet is not as solvent as they pretend. It's Uncle Sam Bankman-Fried. Remember him from the crypto crisis. Just like Sam Bankman-Fried used your deposits to buy shit coins, using accounting tricks to fool himself and others into using the money, so too did the banks. They all used the deposits to buy ultimate shitcoin, long-dated U.S. treasuries. And they all got wrecked at the same time, in the same way, because they bought the same asset from the same vendor who devalued them at the same time, the Fed. Specifically, as New York Times admitted, banks binged on enormous amounts of treasuries and other long-term bonds in 2021. When the flood of printed money cut off their typical demand for loans, and because they thought the Fed would keep interest rates low forever. So they thought the flood of money would never stop. They thought the Fed would keep interest rates low forever. Why? Because the Fed said they would. And they had good reason to believe this. Powell said he'd be patient on rate hikes as late as November 3rd, 2021. And then he was renominated on November 22nd, 2021, and hiked rates much faster than anyone expected. While even Yellen and the FDIC it caused the current banking crisis, him raising rates this fast. Why did Powell delay? Probably for political reasons. Presidents don't like rate hikes, especially running for re-election in 2022. And Powell thought he would wait and just be like Paul Volcker, who was firm and then defeated inflation. But the world isn't the 80s rerun. Hiking from 10 years of near zero interest rates in the 2010s was a surprise attack on every dollar holder. Economics isn't politics. The kind of insane flip-flops that we see in politics don't work when there are actual contracts involved. So anyone who bet on long-term treasuries got killed in 2021, and now anyone who's betting on short-term treasuries is going to get killed in 2023. The absolute worst place that you can have large amounts of assets locked up in is in 3-month treasuries. The 5% interest rate offered by big banks is a trap. Most fiat bank accounts are now a trap for those countries whose central bankers followed the Fed. And he has all these references. So his contention is that the Fed and the Treasury are trying to set a trap for dollar holders. So they start going to these larger banks, because if you have inflation in your country, what is paramount and key is you block the exits. If people can just leave your system, like in Argentina, you can just use the dollar, it makes it a lot harder for the central planners to control what they're trying to control, aka the economy, right? So it makes it a lot harder for them to have the hyperinflation they need if people can just leave, because they need the hyperinflation to get out of the debt problem we're in. They also need you to hold the currency and use it in order to have hyperinflation, because if you're just trading it for Bitcoin, gold, silver, then they can't get that hyperinflation they need, because you can use those assets in the economy. So how do they block you from doing that? Central bank digital currency. How do they implement that? Well, if everyone collapses collapses in on these big banks, then there'll be no more exits. No more exits. So that's his contention. Like I said, I will link his video in the description. I think he says a lot of thought-provoking things. Like I said, he made that bet. I think it was a week ago that in 90 days we're going to have hyperinflation because more and more people are going to start to realize that their bank isn't safe. And all of a sudden, you're going to have this kind of like people when the fire alarm goes off. People don't announce, okay, we're all running, but just all of a sudden, people start running because there's a fire. And people haven't realized there's a fire yet. And once they do, they're going to start running to the exits. What are those exits? Gold, silver, Bitcoin. And he says by the time the CBDC comes out, it'll be too late. So do it now. Food for thought, my humble opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Sorry again for my voice, still a little under the weather, but thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. See you guys in the next one. Peace.